Hi guys, today I'm going to share with you some gouache blending techniques as it's one of my most asked questions. How do I get smooth blends in gouache? So I'm going to do a few demonstrations and I've kept most of the footage in real time so you can follow along with me as well. And so you can see more clearly how I clean my brush, how I use water to thin down the paints, and how I softly blend out all the paint as well. You're going to want to start by squeezing out a generous amount of paint onto your palette, and I'm probably going to be saying this a lot throughout this video, but I prefer to use more paint when it comes to blending because I like to work quite opaquely, and having more paint on the paper just gives me more room to blend the colors as there's just more paint to work with. So start with a generous amount of paint, and here I'm just mixing up a pale pink. We're going to start just by doing a single color flat wash just to get the feel for the consistency of paint. And I've purposely mixed up paint that's a little bit too thick just to show you what happens. If paint is too thick, then as you try to spread it on the paper, it's not going to spread very far. So I add more water in, and you'll also see throughout this video, every time I add more water, I pretty much also add more paint in, and that's just to keep up the level of opacity in the paint. If you find your paint is too dry and you start thinning it out without adding in more paint as well, then your paint's soon going to become very thin and more transparent, and I find it harder to blend on the paper when that happens, and I'll show you an example of that later as well. I've also made sure to mix up enough paint to cover that small square area, so that way I don't have to worry about having to mix up more paint if I run out. So make sure you mix up plenty of paint. And then I'm now going to show you what happens when I use really thin paint. So here I'm just adding lots of water, not adding in any more paint. And I've only noticed this recently, but you can tell your paint is too thin on the palette when you're mixing it, and if you find that the paint is moving around a lot on the palette, that means it's really thin because you have a lot of water on the palette, so it's moving around as you're mixing it. Whereas with thicker paint, it's not going to move around as much because you have a lot more pigment on the palette. I hope that makes sense, but that's something that I notice. I naturally feel how thick or thin the paint is by observing how much the paint is moving around on the palette. Now let's move on to painting a simple gradient. I'm going to start with a dark pink at the top and work towards a pure white, and I'm using plenty of pink and using it quite opaquely, quite thick. So I don't add much more water in because the mixture before was already really runny. So I'm keeping it in that thick consistency. Then I can move towards the paler pink and mix a bit more of that in. And with every stroke, I make it a little bit lighter. I add a bit more white in, and I'll get to a point where I decide to just wash off my brush completely and pick up some pure white paint, because if I want to blend from dark pink to pure white, I'll eventually have to wash off my brush, so I can pick up just some clean white and be able to start painting on a much paler pink. If I don't wash off my brush, I can't achieve that really light pink because I have too much dark pink on my brush. And then you can work your way up. So with the light pink, I overcompensate for how light it is, and then I blend upwards to meet the slightly darker pink, and somewhere in between it's going to just naturally blend together. Then I clean it off again and I go in with pure white paint at the very bottom, and again I bring it up and it just naturally blends with the paint on the paper. So that's why it's important to have a lot of paint on your paper, so you have a lot of paint to work with and you just get this really nice soft blend. You'll also see that I wash off my brush a lot, and sometimes I give it a second wash in the clean tub of water just to wash out any little bit of paint, and then I mostly dry off the brush, then go in with a clean but slightly damp brush to softly blend out any areas that look just a little bit harsh. And I'll show you what happens if I try not to wash off my brush and just keep working down, and I try to blend it to a bright white. Basically, I'm not going to be able to get that clean white at the bottom because I'll have a lot of pink on my brush, so I'll probably end up with a pale pink. So if you do want to paint a transition from a dark color to a white, it's good to work downwards to about halfway or a bit more, and then start to work upwards from the white. So now I'm not washing off my brush, I just try to keep lightening it with more white, and the pink really is overpowering it. I used to feel bad for washing off my brush with so much paint on it, but I realized that by washing my brush I'm actually saving a lot more white paint, because I'll need so much more white paint just to make this pink paler, and white is the color I use up most quickly, so it actually just makes more sense to clean off my brush more frequently and use up less white paint in the process. So if you also feel bad about cleaning your brush off because you feel like there's a lot of paint on there, it's not such a bad thing, you're actually saving more white paint in the end. So now if I try to go in with some clean white paint, I still can't get that pureness. Even if I wait for the paint to completely dry, I still don't think I can get it to be pure white because it's going to just blend with the pink layer underneath. So that was just a few exercises to get you started with gouache and feeling a bit more comfortable with blending. And now we'll try some 2 color gradients. So I'll be using pink and a warm yellow, and I'm just going to start by soaking my brush through and taking off some excess moisture. And first I'm actually purposely going to mix up some really thin paint. I'm going to paint half of the square in the yellow and half of it in pink, and I'll do one with really thin paint and one with much thicker paint, and then we'll let it dry, and I'll come back later and show you what happens when you try to reactivate and blend the 2 colors together. So here I'm purposely using thin paint, and then I'm going to thicken it up and paint in the creamy consistency that I usually like to work with when I'm blending, or just in general I work quite opaquely. There is nothing wrong with working thinly and blending with thin paints. You can work like that if you want a thin layer, or you can even start off thin and then work up your layers until they get thicker and thicker. This is just the way I prefer to blend in gouache. And also most of the time that I'm doing these large areas of blending, it's when I'm painting in the sky, and the sky is what I usually paint first in a landscape. So once I paint that in, I'm done with it. I usually don't need to come back and add more layers on top. So I just paint opaquely, and that just means there's more paint on the paper, it's more creamy, and as I said before, the more paint there is, the more I can work with on the paper and just get a much smoother blend. And we'll see that in a moment as well when I come back to these paints once they're dry. Now let's try working from pink to yellow with a smooth gradient in between. So I'm going to start with the dark pink, and as I move down, I'll add in a little bit of yellow each time. So it's going to turn a bit more orange, and I'll just slowly add in more yellow. And sometimes it isn't perfectly blended out, and I'll just leave it and maybe come back and blend it in a moment. And then when I get to about halfway, that's when I realize I need to just wash off my brush completely and start building in a lot more of the yellow paint. I'm going to overcompensate with the amount of yellow so that way I can blend upwards to meet the pink. So it's really the same technique as what I was doing before when I was blending to white, except now I'm just using a different color. So you can see I'm using a very yellow paint. I didn't really mix any pink into it, and then I'm going to blend upwards and meet the pink halfway, and that's how you can get a really smooth gradual transition. And then I also blend it up some more and add in some more pink as I blend upwards. Then I clean my brush and dry it off and go in with a clean damp brush to blend out any areas that look a little bit harsh. I feel like that's my go-to when I'm blending. I constantly clean it off, dry it off, and just go in with a clean damp brush. And that only works if you have a lot of paint on the paper. If your paint is really thin, if you try to use a damp brush to blend on the paper, it might cause the paper to start peeling, and I'll show you in a second how that can happen. Also, another thing that I do to get a smooth transition is I mix up the in-between color. For example, the area I'm working in now, it's in between the yellow and the orange, so I mix that in-between color to match what's in the middle and blend around the area. And same with the top area, I try to match what's in between those two colors and place that on top and just blend it out with the surrounding areas. Then let's go back into our dried paint from before, and I'm just using a clean damp brush and I'm reactivating the dried paint on the paper. And this was the one where I painted really opaquely, so there's a lot of pigment on the paper, and as I'm reactivating it, it's naturally blending together quite nicely. And then I can just clean my brush and softly blend out the bottom. I'm being really gentle when I'm reactivating because the paper can peel if you're too harsh. So it feels as though I'm just gently brushing on the very top layer of it to reactivate it. Now with the thinner paint that we laid down before, when I try to reactivate the paint to blend it together, it doesn't work as nicely because there's just not that much paint to work with, and the chances of the paper peeling is a lot more likely. I really like that gouache can be reactivated even after it's dry, because it means that you don't have to work really quickly when you're blending. If you're working slowly, you can still blend it out really nicely just with a clean damp brush, which is why I clean my brush so often as well, because I can always go back with that clean damp brush and just blend out any areas that are a little bit harsh, and it just blends together really nicely. Next, I'm going to do pretty much the same thing but blend with the paint while it's wet. So I'm painting half of it in pink, and then I'll paint the bottom half in the warm yellow, and I'll make my way upwards and meet in the middle and see how that goes. So I'm using plenty of paint, a nice creamy consistency, and as I blend upwards, the yellow is going to nicely blend with the pink. So as you can see, there are so many different ways that you can blend with gouache. I really just think it's a matter of practicing and experimenting, and the more you paint with gouache, the more you practice with it, the more you get a feel for how best to blend with it, and you'll get a feel for the consistency of paint. I also go through things like consistency of paint, blending exercises, dry brushing techniques, and that kind of stuff in my Skillshare class, A Beginner's Guide to Gouache, which I'll leave a link down below if you want to check it out on Skillshare. You can get a 2-week free trial with the link and you can try out the class. But back to what I was saying about practicing with gouache. I really think at the end of the day, that's the most important thing. I do my best to try and teach all these things, but really the more you paint with it, the more you'll learn about it rather than just watching my videos, painting will really accelerate the speed at which you understand gouache more. I'm now going to paint a transition from a dark pink to light pink to pure white and then into a light yellow, then a darker yellow. And you can just practice along with me and see how well your control of blending is. It does take quite a bit of control to get it to be very gradual, very smooth transitions, and also to have that clean, pure white in the middle. It can be easy to muddy it if you're not cleaning off your brush and you're not going in with pure white paint in the center. So I've just left this part in real time, so feel free to practice with me. But I think that's about it for all the techniques that I have to share when it comes to blending with gouache. The only other thing I can think of is when I'm blending, I sometimes turn my flat brush on its side so it's horizontal, and that way I get thinner strokes so I can blend a bit more accurately if I'm just trying to carefully place on a little bit of paint. But other than that, that's pretty much most of the techniques that I use when I blend. Things like cleaning off my brush frequently so that the paint isn't going to muddy on the paper. If I'm not cleaning it off frequently enough, once I'm blending on the paper, it's going to pick up that paint and it's easy to muddy the other colors if I keep using that brush with the paint on it. So clean it off frequently. Also just go in with a clean damp brush just to softly blend out any harsh areas, and using plenty of paint on the paper so you have plenty to work with. And lastly, just practice until you get a feel for gouache and you become more confident. At the end of this video, I'll be showing you a repaint of a painting I did last year, which was one of my really early gouache paintings, and I'll come back later and talk a bit more about that. Here's the painting I was talking about earlier. This is one that I did in April of 2020, and it was day 15 out of my 100-day challenge that I decided I would commit to learning gouache. So it was one of my really early gouache paintings, and this one I thought would be good to repaint and see how far I've come in terms of blending, because I remember when I did that painting it was really stressful for me and I didn't feel like I did a good job of blending out the colors. There were some really harsh edges, and I just remember that panicked feeling I had when the colors just weren't blending together nicely. In contrast, when I repainted this today, I felt so much more calm and so much more in control of the painting. I had a quiet confidence that I would be able to paint this without feeling stressed out, and knowing that I could work at it slowly and just blend it out nicely. So this could be a good one for you to practice as well if you really want to put your blending skills to the test. This one is quite tricky because there's a few colors going on, and with that yellow in the middle it can be very easy to muddy it with the blue paint above and paint an unpleasant green, or just in general have a lot of muddiness or a lot of not so pleasant colors in it if you're not careful with the blending, as I wasn't so much in my first attempt at this. So you can try this painting and in the future come back and see how much you've progressed. If you're feeling discouraged with gouache or you're not feeling very confident in it, I hope this can serve as an example of how much you can grow and learn if you just continue to work at the medium. We all have to start somewhere, but I promise that if you practice, you will improve over time. I couldn't have painted this again if I hadn't put in all those hours to practice. And not only did I feel more confident with blending, I also felt my color choices were a lot better and a lot more accurate to the reference photo this time round. So that's another area that I saw my improvement in. Hopefully you found this video helpful, and lastly I just want to let you know that I have real-time tutorials over on my Patreon. I currently have 9 tutorials on there, and I'll be uploading weekly new real-time tutorials. I'll have a link down below where you can check out the tutorials that I've already uploaded on there. And I also opened up a second tier on Patreon where if you want to support my art for a small amount, you can support me on Patreon, and as a little bonus I'll put up some real-time footage of some of my gouache studies, and this painting for example, I'll have it on there in real time just so you can paint along with me if you want to. This one took me about 30 minutes to paint, so I'll have that all linked down below. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye bye.